Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining today's presentation. My name is Panagiotis Christodoulou, and I'm a lecturer at the Department of Computer Science at Annapolis University in Paphos. Our guest tonight is Mr. Robert Cookson. Mr. Cookson worked for 40 years in Europe and the Middle East in senior general management, operations, and technology roles. Now, based in Cyprus, he continues to focus on technology innovation and governance through his consultancy practice InsurTech Information Technology Limited. Tonight, our guest will provide his insights from an IT perspective on a really interesting matter. Mr. Cookson will present the correlations that exist between man-made computer viruses and biological viruses like COVID-19. I would like to remind you that our guest will answer all of your questions at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to post your questions. Good evening, Mr. Cookson.
Good evening. Hi. Okay, thanks for the kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. And thanks also to the IT faculty team at Neapolis University here in Paphos for inviting me to present this webinar. I've always found it fun during my career to explain IT in terms of things in the real world that people can relate to. This is something that I call tech-splanation. I've often been struck by the similarity between digital and biological viruses, both in the way that they infect and propagate and in the methodologies that can be used to defend against them. Being in lockdown these past few months has given me the time to put my thoughts on the subject down on paper, so to speak, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to share them with you in this virtual auditorium. That's right. So the first, can we have the next slide, please? Where, as I'm sure you have all found out by now, we're currently living in the midst of the most infectious, disruptive, and costly biological virus attack that any one of us has experienced. The well-known COVID-19 virus pandemic. Similar to most computer malware attacks, it came seemingly out of nowhere, spreading at exponential speed, and even today continues to seriously disrupt the daily lives of almost the entire population of the world. There are some striking similarities between biological viruses in the natural world and those of the electronic type in the digital world, both in the ways in which they infect and spread, and the means by which they can be combated and hopefully defeated. This is not entirely surprising, actually, as most computer malware was designed to emulate biological viruses in terms of infiltration into the bodies or computer networks of the organisms or organization that it wants to attack. Also, both types of virus do not discriminate amongst potential victims, and generally speaking, they cause the greatest damage to the unprepared and those with existing weaknesses. For many years now, security practitioners in the IT world have been protecting businesses from infection with malicious viruses of the digital kind and helping them to recover as rapidly as possible from infections. Some of the techniques now being adopted by world governments and public health authorities to combat COVID-19 are remarkably similar to those that cybersecurity practitioners have been using for many years. Next slide, please. So, the importance of hygiene. In the IT world, we know that it takes only the most basic digital hygiene measures to significantly reduce the risk of virus infection. By some estimations, simple awareness around such things as password etiquette and understanding of the social engineering techniques used by malicious actors to compromise our networks can reduce the infections or the risk of infections by up to 90%. We're now learning that the risk of infection from the COVID-19 virus can be substantially reduced by the practice of basic hygiene of a physical and social nature, such as hand sanitation, wearing of face masks, and social distancing. I'm sure in the days before COVID-19, we've all seen people from certain cultures from around the world wearing masks, both whilst traveling and whilst out and about in their daily lives. The custom of wearing face masks had been present in some measure in Asian culture for quite some time. However, the practice became more prevalent in response to the increase of transmissible virus epidemics, such as the 2002 SARS and 2006 avian flu outbreaks. This simple, largely unconscious, and mainly cultural hygiene factor, coupled with aggressive and early lockdown measures, seems to have significantly retarded the spread of infection in Eastern Asia in comparison with most countries in Europe. Quite possibly, I think, if the wearing of masks in high-risk social environments had been more a part of Western social culture, then we would have seen much lower rates of infection and consequently a much reduced impact on our way of life. In any event, the wearing of face masks, hand washing and sanitizing, and maintaining a reasonable social distance when in crowded places are all set to become part of everyday life for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. There's an old saying where I come from, is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In terms of risk analysis and planning in the corporate world, there are said to be three types of risk. The first two of them are those that we know and can quantify, and those that we know but cannot easily quantify. The most dangerous category of risk, however, are the risks that we don't know that we don't know. And I think COVID-19 clearly falls into that category. Nobody knew that anything like that could exist out there. The mantra of security in the digital world is planning and preparedness. We run catastrophe simulations, practice cyber incident response techniques, and create awareness campaigns in our user populations to emphasize the need for constant vigilance against cyber attacks and educate them what to do in case they suspect that they have been compromised. We also know that planning and education have to be continually reviewed, refreshed, and reinforced. In the corporate world, we use impact analysis, including sensitivity modeling and stress testing, to estimate the outcomes of identified risks at various levels of severity. Governments and World Health Authorities were taken completely off guard by COVID-19 and would be well advised in future to adopt the same approach to modeling the impacts of new and mutating virus threats. Next slide, please. So, the cost of complacency. Back in October 2016, the UK National Health Service ran something called Exercise Cygnus. Exercise Cygnus was a simulation exercise designed to estimate the impact of a hypothetical H2N2 influenza pandemic on the United Kingdom. The only significant difference between this and the pandemic we are now experiencing is that Cygnus was assumed to be the H2N2 influenza virus, while COVID-19 is a coronavirus. Bear in mind, this is only 4 years prior to COVID actually appearing. It was evident from the simulation exercise that there would be a lack of so-called surge capacity, basically meaning beds, intensive care units, ventilators, and so on and so forth. The full results of the exercise, however, remain classified. No one has been shown the report. And most people understand, or think at least, that that's because it was deemed that it wasn't going to happen anyway, and it would be very expensive to do anything about it in advance. The exercise that was undertaken, however, provided important information which could have been used to help estimate the economic cost of total lockdown. And I'm sure that if the transmission ratio, infection and death rates had been modeled at the levels that they turned out to be, the cost of prophylactic measures would have seemed quite reasonable compared to the now evident death toll and cost of the bailout of the UK economy. The same is true of cyber risk analysis exercises. Too often, companies ignore the potentially catastrophic results of a malware attack. And in this day and age of increasing data privacy legislation, such as the GDPR, companies simply cannot afford to ignore the economic loss and the reputational damage that a data security breach could cause. Complacency is as much a cardinal sin in the social world as it is in the digital world, and far more costly. Next slide, please. So, a little bit, couple of words about connectivity. Forgive my slight joke about the fridge, but I'm being told that fridges will be able to talk to us in the very near future and tell us that you're missing some eggs, or the milk's gone off, or whatever. Time to stock up on beer, maybe. So when I started my business career, there were no personal computers, no internet, no telefax machines, and we communicated with each other by using analog telephone or by writing letters. Over the past 50 years, the world, both the world of things and the world of people, has become increasingly interconnected. In the physical world, international travel is much more prevalent than it was 50 years ago. People take more holidays abroad, businessmen fly around the world on business trips, social gatherings of people are larger by and large. People simply come into physical contact with more other people more frequently than before. Well, at least they did until January. In the digital world, this interconnectedness is both a blessing and a curse. The internet allows people to connect and share freely with each other, irrespective of location. Unfortunately, it also provides bad guys with the ideal platform to share their malware. Networks are now expanding to include things as well as people. The so-called Internet of Things will eventually allow us to receive messages from everyday appliances and send instructions in return. Connected devices will also talk to one another and make decisions on whether to perform routine tasks such as switching on the light on, preheating the oven, or ordering potatoes from the online supermarket. This materially expands the so-called attack surface for malware to penetrate into our home networks. Many of these devices do not have the same level of virus or antivirus protection than we have on our computers or in the corporate world on servers and so forth. Some of these internet-connected devices have no security. And given that they are actually sitting on our home networks, they are a very simple target, an easy target for guys to try and penetrate through to. I mean, they're not interested in our fridges, but they may be interested in getting through our fridge into our home network and infecting our computers. The one good thing for us is that biological viruses cannot propagate across digital networks. They require human contact to do so. So as the internet is the ideal medium for digital virus transmission, it has allowed us to safely stay in digital contact with family, friends, and colleagues at a time that we've been forced to limit direct human interactions. Thankfully, in this one respect, digital and biological viruses are very different. Next slide. In the IT world, computers, servers, and other hardware devices are collectively known as endpoints. That's what we IT people call servers, computers, printers even. And they're usually grouped together and communicate with each other across networks. Endpoints on human social networks are called people. We can view people as being very similar in the way that they interact with each other to computer networks in terms of their interconnectedness. Now, in the IT world, networks can be flat or segregated into subnetworks, with each subnetwork serving a specific purpose. This is known as micro-segmentation. Having a more granular network segmentation in place on an IT network can allow a more targeted network shutdown, allowing some aspects of communication to continue whilst the extent of the infection is diagnosed. Human social networks are naturally micro-segmented, but also highly interconnected between themselves. The surest, if not the most elegant way to stop the spread of a virus across a digital network is to shut it down completely. Social lockdown was implemented with the same end in mind. It was intended to shut down human social networks as far as possible, isolate human endpoints from one another to curtail the spread of the virus, and basically protect people from one another. Unfortunately, there was very little historical data available on how human social network segments interlink. Perhaps if more information had been available on what the virus transmission rates were likely to be for each separate network segment, for example, school, business, social, it might have been possible to shut down discrete elements of the overall social network and avoid total lockdown with less harmful social and economic consequences. To a certain extent, that's what's been trialed in the UK. If anybody has been following the news in the UK with the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 lockdowns, essentially they're trying to limit the spread of the virus without necessarily locking everything and everybody down completely. So I guess in a way that that's already been tried. Unfortunately, in the UK, which is where I come from, they've just announced another 4-week total lockdown. So clearly, I think the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 lockdowns weren't necessarily as effective as they hoped it might be. Next slide, please. Okay, so this one's called zero trust. Never assume, always verify. In the IT world, there's a relatively new concept in computer network access management called zero trust. The old model was called trust by default. And the assumption was that having been initially validated and inside the network with my computer, it could be assumed that I passed the network access test rules and therefore had the right to remain there indefinitely and also move around without any further need for validation. So one-time validation only. Some computer viruses, however, are designed to lay low without displaying any adverse symptoms or suspicious behavior, silently propagating around the network until such time as an opportunity appears for them to activate and do their dirty work. This incubation period can be measured in days, months, or even years. Zero trust, however, means that I, or that my computer that is, have to re-establish trustworthiness periodically or each time that I want to move to a different part of the network or connect to an associated network or interact with a new network resource. Translated into social networking terms, in the days before COVID-19, trust by default meant that people were assumed not to have the virus and were allowed to move freely around and interact with others unless they started to exhibit symptoms, by which time, of course, it was too late to prevent them from transmitting the virus to the people with whom they'd been in contact. Now, on a recent trip to Dubai, I experienced a very nice example of how zero trust can be applied in social terms. In order to get on the plane in Larnaca to go to Dubai, I had to take a negative COVID test with me. Once I got to Dubai, I had a second test at the airport and was obliged to isolate until the results of the test became available, which fortunately was just over 24 hours, so it didn't really make too much of an impact on my business trip. After I'd been in Dubai for a week, I then returned to Cyprus. Landing in Larnaca, I had one more test. Again, the result was available quite quickly and fortunately was negative. But I still had to self-isolate for another 14 days and then take another COVID test before I was finally deemed to be COVID-free, if you want to call it that, and allowed to go back about my business in the same way as everybody else is allowed to go about their business. Now that, if you think about it, is a pretty good example of never trust, always verify. I was actually verified 4 times in order to make a simple business trip, which in the olden days I would have made without thinking, without batting an eyelid. Now, a lot of other countries are implementing similar testing and self-isolation rules for travelers. You'll probably have heard on the news that the UK is gradually extending the list of countries where it requires a 14-day self-isolation before people can move around. The latest, I think, was Germany and Sweden quite recently. So obviously, other countries are catching on to the idea that it's a good idea to verify and not trust too much. Now, once vaccinations against COVID-19 are available, it is highly likely that many countries will require proof of vaccination for incoming travelers in much the same way as in the past. Certain countries in Africa required proof of vaccination against yellow fever. I can remember going to Africa a couple of times many years ago, and I had to carry a yellow fever vaccination card with me. Otherwise, they wouldn't have let me in through the airport. So until an effective vaccine is developed, and maybe even afterwards, we are going to have to become accustomed to living in a world of zero or substantially reduced trust. Next slide, please. So, a couple of thoughts on testing and tracing, or tracking and tracing, depending on how you like to call it. This is happening in the COVID world, but it's also been happening in the IT world for many, many years now. Endpoints and networks in the digital world all have logging features, and they record in minute detail everything that happens on any machine or any of its constituent elements, such as programs, executables, files, and the like. And there are also automated security alerting software programs that take these so-called event logs and subject them to various forms of analysis. Security analysts in the IT world spend considerable time reviewing these logs and the outputs from security monitoring, looking for unusual events that could signal attempted interference from outside, and in the worst case, an actual malware infection. This is the digital equivalent of what many countries are now implementing in terms of what they call test and trace. The inherent problem with these activities in both worlds, in both digital and biological worlds, is that the number of events logged is substantial, if not overwhelming, and that the monitoring of these events invariably generates a large number of so-called false positives. Human networks are far more complex and interconnected than electronic ones, and all of us are members of a number of networks. We intersect with family, friends, colleagues, random strangers on public transport, in cafes, bars, restaurants, and so on. In the social world, an interaction with any one person constitutes at arm's length a potential interaction with all members of that other person's own social networks. I'm sure you will have heard of the famous idea of 6 degrees of separation, which is also quite interestingly known as the 6 handshakes rule. And that's the idea that anyone in the world is 6 or fewer social connections away from any other person. So you know 6 people, they know 6 people, and so on and so forth. So by the time you reach the end of the chain, you could actually establish a connection to anybody else in the world. I'm not actually sure whether this is accurate. I'm not that good at mathematics, but just imagine going to a function at which 216 people are present. Could be a work gathering, could be a largish wedding or so on, and you shake hands with 6 of those people. If each of them had shook hands with 6 of the others, and those 6 had in turn shaken hands with 6 themselves, you would effectively have had physical contact with all 216 attendees. So it's very easy to see how things like weddings and large social gatherings have been targeted as hotspots for virus transmission. Computer networks often have hundreds or even thousands of connected endpoints. However, their interconnects are more easy to determine if you understand the network topology, as it's called. The problem for scientists in the biological world is that the topography of social networks is highly complex, and consequently, virus transmission pathways are extremely difficult to model. And as a result of this, many governments are now trialing contact recording apps, as we said earlier, which are installed on our mobile phones, which record who we've intersected with during the course of our daily life, and in the case of an infection alert, warn us and those with whom we've been in near contact, so that they can take appropriate action. Now, on the face of it, it makes good sense to implement test and trace as a feature of network management in daily social life. However, the same problem applies as with IT network. The number of interactions to be analyzed is huge, and the potential number of false positives generated is substantial. Just as a side note, there's already a hot debate has started as to whether the data recorded on your mobile phone, if you have such a contact recording application, whether that's your personal data and whether it's can't be shared by governments anyway. But I think we'll leave that one for the experts to decide. What I think would be really interesting, if we had one of those devices on our mobile phones, would be for us to actually see the data in a way that we could understand it, so in a visual sort of way, so that we could see ourselves how many people we've been in contact with or with whom we've been in indirect contact during the course of a normal day out and about. Like with the example of the 6 people after 216, I think we'd all be very surprised to know how many indirect contacts we've had during the course of a day. And that, I think, would be a really good example of big data. Next slide, please. So now we come to the importance of governance. It's a fact that lay people, the man on the street, both in what we call the corporate user community and in the general social community, they need guidance and they need rules. In the corporate world, governance is the responsibility of senior management, ideally promoted from the board of directors downwards. Corporate governance encompasses such activities as risk identification, risk analysis and risk mitigation, compliance, audit, security, many other different activities. And they're all designed with one aim in mind: to keep the corporate entity safe from internal and external threats. In the general population, governance is the responsibility of government and government agencies. Leaders, whether the governments of countries or the executive management of corporations, need to provide timely, clear, unambiguous, and practical guidance. They also need to implement adequate controls to ensure that people do not behave irresponsibly and impose sanctions if they do. Unfortunately, there'll always be a minority of people that ignore advice, and there were well-publicized examples of this in the UK some months ago. Some of them from people in very responsible positions who should have known better. In my work in the corporate field, I have seen many examples of this "do as I say, not as I do" mentality. For example, where managers or people in responsible positions think it's okay to use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as their password. At the end of the day, the ultimate responsibility, irrespective of government and governance, advice and so on, rules and regulations, it's down to the individual to behave responsibly. Next slide, please. Okay, so trust in God, but tie up your donkey. Basically, it means, okay, no matter what anybody else is doing, you need to make sure that you take care of your stuff yourself, rather than relying on anyone else. Now, in the digital world, we continuously seek better physical and logical protections against virus threats. Antivirus software programs that we trust to monitor our computers are updated regularly, but it is a constant battle between the good guys who want to protect us and the bad guys who want to do us or our computers at least harm. Our immune system is the body's equivalent of computer antivirus software, responding by developing antibodies against new virus strains which it encounters. The acquisition of immunity can be assisted by vaccination. However, right now, a vaccine against COVID-19 is not available, and for the time being at least, we should act as if it won't be. If a vaccine or vaccines are developed, it will still be a mistake to assume immunity against the virus just because we have been vaccinated. In the same way, it would not be safe to assume that we can blindly open dubious email attachments just because we have McAfee antivirus installed. The key thing to remember with both types of virus is that if we act irresponsibly, our actions will impact not only us, but on many others downstream. Next slide, please. Final slide. So there's been a lot of discussion, debate over the months about this thing that people have called the new normal. I think that the new normal is already with us, unfortunately. I did give a version of a similar talk to a group of cybersecurity practitioners back in June this year. And at that time, people were predicting that social and business life would dramatically change. Others were quite confident that everything would be back to normal by the end of the year. Now, what I said at the time was that in my experience, people in general have very short memories. And once they think that danger has passed, they tend to revert to previous behaviors. I said that we will probably have to learn to live with the virus in the community with periodic renewed outbreaks, as with the normal influenza virus. I said that both types of virus will continue to evolve and mutate, and security specialists in the digital world and health leaders in the natural world will have to continue to deal with the risks that they pose. I also said that for economic reasons, we cannot remain in full lockdown forever. And at the time, I voiced the hope that at some stage we would be able to start trusting again and opening up to social contact. These have all happened. Unfortunately, in terms of the opening up again, this has in many countries, perhaps not so much in Cyprus, fortunately, but in most of Europe, the result has been that infection rates have started to grow again. In my opinion, I don't think COVID is going to go away, much as digital viruses are not going to go away. And we have to change our behavior permanently. In order to prevent renewed cycles of restriction, I think it's now inevitable, excuse me, that in the absence of an effective virus vaccine, the wearing of face masks, regular hand washing and sanitizing, and maintaining reasonable social distance is going to become all part of everyday life. With or without a vaccine, the new normal in the physical world will start to more closely resemble the established normal in the digital world, where constant vigilance, effective governance, good education, hygiene, informed decision-making, and above all, basic common sense are the order of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cookson, for this interesting presentation. To be honest, before our first meeting, I have never thought that there is actually a correlation between computer and biological viruses, especially on the means that can be used to stop the transmission of the virus. I'm pretty sure that now, after this presentation, our audience will share the same opinion as I do, that there is actually a correlation between those types of viruses. All faculty members of the Science Department located at Neapolis University in Paphos would like to publicly thank you for sharing your views with us as well as for your time. Hopefully next semester you can give a more technical presentation to our students. So now I think it's better to move to the Q&A.
Happy to do so.
Thank you. So, Andreas, do you have any questions for Mr. Cookson? So we have a question here from Zenonos. So, are the economic consequences of a global internet attack comparable to the economic consequences of the COVID-19 outbreak?
That's a very good question. When you say global internet attack, are you talking about a complete collapse of the internet worldwide?
I think our guest here especially means of a global internet attack, maybe worldwide at the same time, I think.
Well, I would think that it's likely to be more severe. I mean, so much of the world these days, so much of business is transacted digitally. Imagine having to go back to the times that I mentioned when I started my career 50 years ago, when you didn't have internet, there were no fax machines. The only way you could speak to somebody was on an analog telephone. Or write them a letter, which probably takes a week to get there. I mean, Amazon would certainly not like that kind of scenario. But the fortunate side of it is that, as I said, biological viruses don't affect the electronic world. So the economic impact would be quite severe, but I think the impact in terms of human suffering, i.e., death, would be much less. I don't think that the internet going down would necessarily cause so many people to be hospitalized or suffer more serious consequences. But let's wait and see. I mean, we haven't seen the end of COVID yet. The latest statistics in the UK, I think they've already spent 50 billion English pounds keeping the economy going, and they're likely to spend probably the same amount again by March next year. And that's just one country, so pretty severe.
Thank you, Mr. Cookson, for your answer.
But that's just my opinion. I'm not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. We're very fortunate, as I said, that we have the internet, because can you imagine lockdown without even being able to, do a Zoom call with a family member or a colleague? Everybody would have been very seriously cut off.
So basically, if COVID-19 existed 20 years ago without having the opportunity for a remote work, this could have severe economic consequences, as I can imagine.
Yeah. Interesting question from Vagelis, if I'm pronouncing your name right. If not, then I apologize. Are the big companies made up their viruses to infect us and then save us, or is it just a conspiracy theory? Yeah, I've had many very interesting discussions on that subject with my wife, who spends more time on Facebook than I do. It's certainly very tempting to think that somebody out there may have caused it on purpose. I personally don't think so. I think these viruses are things which are probably going to hit us more frequently. I mean, we've been lucky in the last, when was it? The last serious one was 1929, I think, was the Spanish flu. So we've been quite lucky that there hasn't been anything more serious. So no, I personally don't subscribe to the conspiracy theory, although I know that there are many people out there on Twitter and Facebook that think it's all a big ploy by, I don't know, the Chinese or Satanists or whoever it may be.
Thank you for your opinion. Any more questions?
Good question. Can we ask everybody else to chip in? Anybody else? Are we doing any polling on this? I'd be really interested to know how many of the other guests think that the conspiracy theory is potentially valid.
Basically, we can create a poll after this presentation and ask our, let's say, university students or any other who provide an answer to this poll and provide the results within some days. So we have another question here from Constantino. The mask wearing habit will become a fixed feature of social life as it happens in Asian countries?
Yes, I think it will. Maybe not for everybody, but I mean, right now it's a mandatory feature. I mean, we have to wear a mask because the government tells us that we must do so. I personally think that depending on the circumstance, it would be a very good feature to adopt as part of our everyday life. I mean, what's been brought home to me, I think, more than anything with COVID, is just how easy it is for these viruses to transmit. They sitting on an aeroplane, you can infect somebody 5 seats behind you or 5 seats in front of you. So if it's going to stop me from getting sick and spending time in the hospital, then I would probably continue to wear a mask in high-risk situations. Clearly, it's no fun going to the pub and wearing a mask. It's not possible to drink beer with a mask on anyway. So you have to, I would say you have to look at the situation, make your own risk assessment. I mean, that's what I said during the presentation. People need to be aware of the risks and make their own judgments. And I think that sensible people will realize that if you're on an aeroplane or in a very crowded train or subway, why not? It doesn't do you any harm. It protects you and probably protects the people around you as well.
Correct.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to disrespect the Western nations, but in the Far East, there's much more of a culture of respect for other people than there is here. You know, they really do try to not harm other people, whether it's, you know, by words or by deeds or by actions. And I think we could, in some countries in the West, we've forgotten how to respect others.
Thank you. So, do we have some other question? I think that was the questions that we had. Regards to your opinion about the poll, I'm sure that we can share something, especially to our students, just to see their insights and their opinions on the let's say conspiracy theories. Once again, Mr. Cookson, I would like to thank you. You can share your, if you want to add something, just to before we conclude our free to say it.
No, I think I've said everything that I wanted to say. Thanks for the invitation, by the way. It's been a great amount of fun talking to you and to the other attendees. And yeah, let's do it again.
Thank you. And before we close, we have a last-minute question. So I think it's better also to ask this to you. So I think we have a technical problem. Hello.
Hello.
Back. So yeah, hello.
Yeah, it's flaky. I hope you're not going to ask me who's going to win the presidential election in the US.
No. This is unknown.
Well, I think it's fairly clear now, but we have to wait for the dust to settle, as they say. Yeah.
So one question, and then. So how many people have experienced a malware attack in their private or corporate life? If there is any study in regards to this, if you...
I could probably find some statistics on that. I mean, I read many emails every day from various publications. And if you listen to the people selling antivirus software or cybersecurity services, there are millions and millions of people who are attacked every day. And I think it's true to say that the bad guys are always out there trying to break in through the front door. I personally had 2 malware attacks when I was in corporate life. Both of them were quite alarming because it just shows you how vulnerable you are. And in terms of personal awareness, both of them came through passwords being phished through emails. So it's fairly clear that the front line of any form of cyber defense is the user. You can buy as much expensive IT equipment as you like, But if somebody's going to give their password away to some phishing scam, then that's not going to do you any good. So the first line of defense is always you, whether it's you as an individual on your home computer, or you as a user on your corporate network. I think the prevalence of malware attacks on personal computers is getting less and less, because the antivirus software now is really very, very, very good. But the bad guys are trying other methods, not trying to infect your computer, but trying to steal your password so they can get at your Facebook account and so on and so forth. So they kind of they haven't gone away. They're just trying different. Instead of trying to come through the front door, they're trying the side door or the bathroom window.
Thank you very much. So
You're welcome.
I think there are no more questions. Thanks again. Hopefully next semester you can also come here at the university. The university will be open, and so you can actually give a live presentation and not an online presentation to our students. We will be in touch. Thanks again. So have a nice night. Thanks to our audience.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.